The corridors of Windsor Castle have witnessed centuries of secrets. But what unfolded behind those ancient stone walls in the quiet weeks following the death of Queen Elizabeth II was something that even the most seasoned royal insiders never saw coming. It began with a letter. Not a public statement, not a palace press release. A private, handwritten letter sealed, stamped, and buried inside a legal document that was never meant to see the light of day. Prince William had been sorting through his grandmother's personal correspondence. A routine task, they said, a matter of duty, but nothing about what William found that afternoon was routine. Because buried inside a stack of estate documents, between property deeds and correspondence from Balmoral's land registry, was evidence of something that made William's blood run cold. Camilla had been moving pieces on a chessboard that no one else could even see. Sources close to the royal household describe William's reaction as visibly shaken. One insider, speaking under strict anonymity to a well-known British investigative journalist, said, and I quote, "He went completely silent, the kind of silence that fills a room." What had he found? Documents suggesting that Camilla, quietly, methodically, and with surgical precision, had been attempting to redirect the inheritance rights to Balmoral's historic cottage, the private retreat Queen Elizabeth herself had earmarked specifically for Lady Louise Windsor, her beloved granddaughter. Lady Louise, a young woman who had stood by her grandmother's side through some of the monarchy's darkest hours, a young woman the Queen trusted completely, a young woman who, according to multiple royal insiders, was the Queen's quiet favorite. And now that legacy was under threat. But here is the question that no one inside Buckingham Palace dares to answer publicly. How long had Camilla's plan been in motion? And who else inside the royal family already knew? Here's the cinematic, storytelling script for the video titled William Discovers Camilla's Darkest Plot Against Louise's Balmoral Inheritance. Crown Exposed. Section 1. The Hook, approximately 500 words. The corridors of Windsor Castle have witnessed centuries of secrets. Walls soaked in whispered betrayals, silent power struggles, and royal decisions made in the dead of night, far from the cameras, far from the public, and far from the truth. But what unfolded behind those ancient stone walls in the quiet weeks following the death of Queen Elizabeth II was something that even the most seasoned royal insiders never saw coming. It began with a letter. Not a public statement, not a carefully worded palace press release. A private, handwritten letter, sealed, stamped, and buried inside a stack of legal documents that were never meant to see the light of day. Documents that sat inside a mahogany drawer in one of Balmoral's private administrative offices, untouched for months, waiting, as if they knew someone would eventually come looking. Prince William had been assigned the task of reviewing his grandmother's personal estate correspondence. A routine responsibility, palace officials insisted. A matter of duty and protocol. But nothing, absolutely nothing, about what William discovered that gray Scottish afternoon was routine. Because buried between Balmoral's land registry records and a series of property transfer authorizations was a document trail so carefully constructed, so deliberately hidden, that it could only have been assembled by someone who understood the inner mechanics of royal estate law with frightening precision. Camilla had been moving pieces on a chessboard that no one else could even see. Sources close to the royal household, speaking exclusively to a senior investigative correspondent at a major British publication, describe William's reaction in the moments after reading those documents as viscerally shaken. One insider, under strict conditions of anonymity, recalled the scene with chilling clarity. He went completely silent, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it suffocates it. His hands, reportedly, were trembling. What had he uncovered? A series of documents, including internal estate memos, redirected correspondence, and what appears to be an unauthorized amendment to a property allocation letter, suggesting that Camilla had been working quietly, methodically, and with surgical legal precision to redirect the inheritance rights of Balmoral's most historically significant private cottage, a cottage that Queen Elizabeth herself had personally earmarked for Lady Louise Windsor. In writing, Lady Louise, the young woman who had stood faithfully by her grandmother's side through some of the most turbulent chapters in modern royal history, the granddaughter who never chased headlines, never courted controversy, and never once betrayed the Queen's trust. The young woman that multiple senior royal insiders describe consistently and passionately as Elizabeth's quiet, unwavering favorite. And now that legacy, that final, intimate act of a grandmother's love, was being systematically dismantled from the inside. But here is the question that has begun circulating through the most private corridors of Buckingham Palace. The question that no official spokesperson will touch and no royal commentator will say on camera. How long had Camilla's plan been in motion, and how deep does the conspiracy truly go? To understand how Camilla could have orchestrated something this audacious, you have to go back, further than most people realize. The groundwork, according to sources familiar with royal estate law, was not laid after the Queen's death. It was laid before it. In the final 18 months of Queen Elizabeth's life, as her health quietly declined behind palace walls and the world held its breath, certain administrative decisions were being made at Balmoral that bypassed the usual chain of royal oversight. Small adjustments, subtle redirections, the kind of paperwork changes that only an expert would notice, and only if they were specifically looking. And nobody was looking. Because the public was focused on the Queen's health, the media was focused on Harry and Meghan. The palace machinery was consumed by the logistics of a transition of power that everyone knew was coming, but nobody wanted to speak aloud. Camilla had chosen her moment with terrifying precision. While the entire world was watching one hand, she had been moving with the other. But what nobody anticipated, not Camilla, not her advisors, not the legal architects of this quiet conspiracy, was that William would go looking through those drawers himself. And what he found next would change everything. William didn't go to the press, not immediately. That is perhaps the most telling detail of this entire story, because a man acting on impulse, a man driven purely by anger or grief, would have leaked those documents within hours, would have called a trusted journalist, would have let the story detonate on its own. But William is not that man. Instead, according to sources deeply embedded within the royal household, he did something far more calculated, far more dangerous for Camilla's carefully constructed plan. He began building a case. Over the following days, William quietly requested access to Balmoral's full estate administrative archive, framing it internally as a routine post-accession review of Crown properties. A perfectly reasonable request. A request that raised no alarms. A request that gave him exactly what he needed. And what emerged from that archive was staggering. 3 separate property allocation memos dated across a 14-month period, each one subtly but unmistakably altered. The original language in Queen Elizabeth's personal directive had been unambiguous. The Balmoral cottage was to pass directly to Lady Louise Windsor upon the Queen's death. No conditions, no intermediaries, no delays. But in the amended versions buried inside that archive, that language had been softened, redirected, replaced with legal phrasing so deliberately vague that it effectively suspended Louise's inheritance claim, leaving the property in an administrative gray zone that could be quietly reassigned. Legal experts consulted anonymously by 2 senior British journalists described the alterations as, and these are their words, not accidental. This required someone with intimate knowledge of royal estate documentation protocols. Someone on the inside. Someone with access, someone whose position within the royal family had granted them a level of administrative authority that very few people even knew existed. And the signature on the authorization request was one that William recognized immediately. The name on that authorization request did not belong to a palace administrator. It did not belong to a legal advisor or an estate manager or any of the nameless bureaucrats who quietly keep the royal machinery running. It belonged to someone far closer to the crown. And in that moment, standing alone in that cold, document-lined room deep inside Balmoral's administrative wing, William understood with absolute clarity that this was not a clerical error. This was not a misunderstanding born from the chaos of transition. This was not an accident of paperwork. This was deliberate, calculated, premeditated. Sources describe William making a single phone call that evening, not to his legal team, not to a palace communications officer, not even to Catherine, though she would be told everything within hours. He called Princess Anne. Because if there was one person inside the royal family who understood Balmoral's estate history, with the depth and authority needed to validate what William had found, it was Anne. A woman who had spent decades quietly protecting the integrity of the royal household, far from the spotlight, with a fierce and unsentimental devotion to the crown's true legacy. Anne's response, according to a source with direct knowledge of that conversation, was immediate and unambiguous. She told him, "Don't move, don't speak to anyone, and whatever you do, don't let those documents out of your sight." By the following morning, two of Britain's most senior royal estate legal counsels had been privately contacted. A confidential review process, completely off the official palace record, had been quietly initiated. Camilla, meanwhile, was preparing for a scheduled public engagement at Buckingham Palace, smiling, composed, entirely unaware that the walls she had so carefully built around her plan were already beginning to crack. But the most devastating revelation was still 48 hours away. 48 hours. That is all it took for everything Camilla had spent months carefully constructing to begin collapsing under its own weight. The confidential legal review initiated by William and Princess Anne had moved with quiet but devastating efficiency. By the second morning, the two senior estate counsels had cross-referenced every amended document against Balmoral's original administrative registry, a master archive that even Camilla's most trusted advisors apparently did not know existed. A registry that recorded every access request, every document retrieval, and every administrative amendment made to royal estate files dating back decades. The timestamps told the story with brutal precision. Every single alteration to Queen Elizabeth's original property directive had been accessed during a narrow 6-week window, a period that coincided exactly with the Queen's most severe health decline, a period when the palace was at its most vulnerable, a period when oversight was at its absolute minimum. And every single access request during that window had been authorized through one specific internal channel, a channel that traced directly back to Camilla's private administrative office. When William was presented with the completed legal review, bound, documented, and formally witnessed, sources describe him sitting completely still for a long moment, not with anger, not with shock, but with the quiet, settled expression of a man who had suspected the truth and was now simply watching it confirm itself. He had one question for the legal counsel sitting across from him. "Is this enough?" The counsel's response was 3 words. "More than enough." Within hours, private communications had been dispatched to the most senior figures within the royal legal establishment. Lady Louise had been quietly notified, and somewhere inside Buckingham Palace, behind the perfectly maintained public facade of royal unity, Camilla's world was about to shatter completely.